friends are since.
Whenever I'm writing new music, whether it's with my guitar and we're doing it as part of a band, or whether I'm using my modular system, the way I like to approach things is to separate out the compositional part of the process from the arrangement elements. And by this, what I mean is that when I'm exploring different sounds or experimenting with different melodies, the last thing I want to worry about, at that point at least, is how I'm going to structure everything and make it work as a cohesive end product. And so in order to approach this, what I tend to do is record my sequences or my riffs or whatever it might be, and I'll record them into my DAW as loops. And that way later on I can move them about and use them as blocks to build up a structure that makes sense at that point. Now obviously for this to work, everything actually needs to be to a click or to a particular tempo, because otherwise you can't move your loops about and have them all kind of in sync and in time with each other. And so whether it's playing your guitar to a click track, or whether it's syncing up your sequencers and your synthesizers up to the MIDI output of your DAW, you have to find some way to make sure that everything is in time. Now this is a perfectly easy, straightforward thing to do, you would think, when it comes to electronic instruments. All you have to do is send out a MIDI clock from your DAW. However, something that I ran into as a big issue and had to contend with for years was that the MIDI clock output that you get from your standard DAW is not particularly stable. Now, as hard as this might be to believe, and trust me, I didn't believe it for a long time, because surely a £4,000 computer should be able to spit out a stable MIDI clock. For whatever reason, the MIDI output that you get from your standard DAW suffers from a lot of jitter, which means that it is not perfectly stable, and that means that in turn, especially when you're working with sensitive electronic instruments that rely on a stable MIDI clock, when you go back to record, you can find that your loops are all a wee bit off grid and things don't quite start at the right point and nothing syncs up the way you would want it to. And whilst this might not be an issue for everybody, this is definitely something that I experienced, and it became a living nightmare where every time I was trying to make music, I was having to spend an inordinate amount of time adjusting things or time stretching things, and honestly it just wasn't a very pleasant experience at all. Now there is a solution to this problem, and it comes in the form of a dedicated hardware sync box. There are a couple of options out there, but by far the most ubiquitous, the one that's easiest to set up and configure and which has the most features is this. This is the ERM Multiclock, and if you've watched any of my other music production videos, you'll know that I talk about this every so often because it really has become an integral part of my setup. Now the way that this device and other similar devices work is that it takes an audio output from your DAW as opposed to a MIDI clock, and for various reasons that I'm not going to be able to explain here, the audio output from your DAW is inherently more stable than the MIDI output. This device then converts that stable audio output into a rock solid MIDI clock that you can then disperse amongst your various devices. And you can see in the back here, this one has got 4 different MIDI outputs and the audio input, etc. Now the big problem with the Multiclock, as wonderful as it is that it is not a cheap device by any stretch of the imagination, and in fact these still go for between £400 and £500, and I can hear the audible gasp reverberating through YouTube as I utter those words, and trust me, it wasn't something that I, loved spending money on. It seems like such a basic thing that you should be able to do without having to get such a premium product. However, unfortunately, there hasn't really been an affordable alternative that's as easy to use as a Multiclock, or at least until this point. Now recently I was looking through Facebook, and on a Facebook ad of all things, I came across a device which might actually act as an affordable alternative to the Multiclock, at least in the sense of providing you a stable MIDI output from your DAW, and that is this thing which I have here. This is the Midronome. Now the Midronome is currently in prototype stage. I believe I've got one of only 3 devices that exist at the moment. It's currently a Kickstarter project, and so you will need to back it before it will become, it will come into existence. My understanding is that if they don't meet their target on Kickstarter, they might not actually be able to make any more of these. But this could well be an affordable alternative to the Multiclock, and so when I saw this advertised, I got in touch with Simon, who's the guy behind this, and I asked him to send me one of his devices so that I could check it out for myself and see if it worked. So I've had it for the past few days, and I've been experimenting with it, and actually seems to be pretty good. So I'm going to move over to my desk table thing here and talk to you a wee bit more about the specific features of this, because it's actually quite exciting. So this is the Midronome, and hopefully, as you can see from this view here, it's actually really quite a wee dinky device indeed. And to accentuate that point, if I bring in the Multiclock here, which is in of itself not a massive device, the Midronome is actually about half the size of this. And this means that not only will it not take up a huge amount of room in your studio, which I think is really important when we're talking about utility devices, but also it's portable enough to take with you gigs and not have to worry too much or think about how you're going to transport it. It literally can slip into your pocket. Now, when we're talking about using devices live, obviously one of the main considerations there is how robust these devices actually are and the build quality. And even though this is a prototype unit, I do have to say that it's extremely well built, the case is all metal, and I would have no qualms or concerns about using this live, at least no more concerns than using any other kind of electronic instrument. Now, if I flip the Midronome over onto its side, I'll show you the various connections that are available. We have power over USB. There's no audio or MIDI over USB, at least in this one. This is an old printer style, big, thick B USB connection, if you're familiar with them. Does anyone still have printers anymore apart from me? Maybe not. Anyway, we have an audio input here, which is on a 1/4" jack. It is marked as a pedal input, and that's because you can configure this in a variety of different ways. So not only can you send an audio output from your DAW into this and sync it up, but you can also sync it up with, for example, a drum pad. And this is really cool because it means that, let's say you're playing live and you want to sync up something with your drummer, you could add a trigger onto one of their drums or one of their drum pads or foot, pedals or whatever it might be, and then this will match the tempo that your drummer is playing at and consistently update so that everything is in time, which is a really, really smart kind of feature to have. Here we have two different MIDI outputs. These are on full-size MIDI DIN, thank God, and these can be linked or kind of operated separately. Here we have an audio output, and this is on 1/4" jack as well. You can either have line out or you can have headphone outputs, and this is so that you can send a metronome which matches the tempo here via whatever you want to do. So let's say you want to get your audio from your DAW, sync up this, and then send out the metronome to your drummer, for example, over headphones. This lets you do that. Now, over on the side, we also have this bonus here, which is a mini jack output. This is for analog clock. And the cool thing about this is that you can sync up a modular system or something, but you can also configure the PPQN of the output, which means that you can ostensibly sync up devices which are a bit difficult or use kind of strange PPQN. For example, pocket operators and Volcas, which are both a bit notoriously difficult to sync. So that's a really nice feature as well. I have connected up the Midronome now to the power so that you can see it in operation, and probably the first thing you'll notice here is this big beautiful display that tells you at a glance what tempo the device is operating at. This clear indicator of the tempo is something I really like about the Midronome, but if you think it's a bit too bright, you can adjust that in the settings. Now, obviously, the main reason I'm interested in this is syncing it up to a DAW for a reliable MIDI clock. And you might be wondering how exactly you do that in terms of what kind of audio output do you need in order for this box to do its magic? And the answer to that is kind of twofold. You can either send out a manual pulse, which this will then lock onto, or you can use a specific VST that the developers have designed, which will send out the relevant pulses at the particular volume you need, depending on the tempo that your DAW is at. And that is similar, if not exactly the same, to the operation of the Multiclock. Now, I have to say that at this point, I haven't been able to test this out with the VST because it's not quite ready yet, but I did test it out with a pre-configured sync file, which was just an audio output, and that worked really well. I'm not going to show you it synced up to my laptop because honestly, it's the most boring thing in the world to watch, and it's also a pain in the arse to shoot, but I can assure you that it did sync up nicely, at least well enough for my purposes. I can't give you any scientific kind of comparison against other clock or anything like that, but it does the job equally as well to my Multiclock as far as I'm concerned. Now there's a couple of things to note about this that differ slightly from the multi-clock. The first thing is you might notice here that we have a clock running all the time. Whether or not there's an incoming clock, the master clock will run in here. Whether or not it sends out a clock to the MIDI output depends on whether or not you press the play button. Now in order to sync up with your DAW, you need a bar before it actually starts to lock onto the tempo. So for this to work, what you would do in your DAW is you would send out the sync signal, and then within that bar you would press play, and after that bar, once it's synced up, then it will start spitting out the MIDI output. Now this is fine and it works perfectly well as is, but it is a wee bit fiddly because it does mean you have to manually trigger the play button. And one of the features I've suggested to Simon, who makes this thing, is that they should include a feature where you can manually detect, or sorry, automatically detect an incoming tempo, and then the play button will engage after the bar. So it is a wee bit fiddly, or a wee bit more fiddly than perhaps the multi-clock in that regard, which automatically detects an incoming signal and then presses play essentially, but it still works fine. It's just something to be aware of. Now this device, I believe, was designed primarily in response to the needs of people playing live. So let's say, for example, you've got a drummer, but you've also got someone playing a sequencer, or a synthesizer that's got an arpeggiator or something. How do you keep all of them together? And this is something that actually my band, Hog Wild here, have struggled with, because we used a lot of samples and stuff, and they were rhythmical, but that was a big nightmare to try and get everything in sync when you're playing live. And so this device was designed with the idea that it could be used as a master clock that would then send out the metronome to your drummer, but also send out the corresponding MIDI signal to your sequencers and your samplers and all that kind of thing, and keep them all nice and in sync, which is actually a really cool feature, or a really cool kind of purpose for this device, because there aren't many other things you can get which do it in such a neat way. Now to illustrate this, you can see that I can adjust the tempo here when this is used as a master clock from 30 all the way up to an obscene 400, I think, which is just wild. And if you look down below my right thumb, you'll see that this indicator LED here shows you not only the beats of the bar, but also the bar. So the beats glow red, and then the bar marker flashes green, and that's really useful because it tells you what part of the bar you're in. And you can of course adjust this within the settings. Now the way you use the metronome is really quite smart as well, because there's a whole bunch of configuration options in there. If I unmute this, you will hear the metronome play over my speakers. And you'll note that the bar marker there is much louder than the beat markers, and you can change the volume of these individually so that the bar marker is much louder than the beats, or that the beat marker is louder, whatever you want to do. There's volume adjustments in there. Now the thing that I think is really cool about this, or about the metronome, is you can change the sound of the metronome, so you're not just stuck with a kind of beep sound. You can actually get some really interesting ones. So for example, let's say we want to have the the beat marker at a kind of, a different sound. There's a whole bunch of different sounds available in here, and you've also got some acoustic sounds in there. So I've adjusted both the beat and the bar markers to sound more like a drum kit, which I think is quite nice indeed. So this is the Midronome, and hopefully this has given you an idea of some of the possibilities of this device. There's a whole host of different ways you can configure things, but it's very much going to depend on your own particular setup and needs. So if you think this might fit the bill for something you want to do, I'd encourage you to go check out the documentation, because there's a ton of different menu options that I haven't looked at. Now the main interest for me, as I said, was to use this as a sync box for my DAW, and in terms of what I've seen so far, even though this is a prototype product and things may well be subject to change, this fits the bill as far as I'm concerned. It's about a quarter of the price of the multi-clock, which seems like a no-brainer if this is a problem you've experienced yourself. If this is something you're interested in, go check out the Kickstarter. In April, I think it finishes about the 17th of April 2022. I should say, by the way, that I have no affiliation with these people whatsoever. I'm not getting paid to do this video. I'm not getting to keep this for free. I just thought this looked interesting and might be useful to some people. So consider going and backing it if this is the kind of thing you want. And maybe, hopefully, we'll see it in more commercially, widely available places soon. If you've got any questions, give me a shout and I'll do my best to answer them. But also take a look at the Kickstarter page because there's tons and tons of info on there. I'll leave the link to that below. For now, happy syncing or some other trite phrase. Goodbye.